All right. Happy Friday, everybody. Going live here for the first time, really, on the YouTube channel here, which is now officially the Lifestyle Entrepreneurs Press YouTube channel. So as I've been sharing over the past few weeks and really over the past months and years, but at a more accelerated speed over the past few weeks, new videos on really every aspect of the author journey. We're going to go deep and we're going to go broad in terms of what does it really take to write a great book and how do you bring that to market, aka publish it. And sure, hit the bestseller lists and really, though, use your book as your best business development tool. So that's what we're all about at Lifestyle Entrepreneurs Press. We are the publisher for the passionate, and I am Jesse Krieger, the founder and publisher. And in this broadcast, I want to go into how to break through writer's block and ultimately how to use writer's block or the perception of writer's block as a way to build momentum into the writing process. And to illustrate this, I'll draw on perhaps a few of the books that we've published in my own experience, but I kind of want to dig into the psychology, really, of what goes on when you're writing a book, getting ready to write a book, or actually in the writing process, because it's tricky. And anybody that's written a book or has been involved in that process can probably attest that it can be fraught with difficulty. It can also be, of course, one of the most inspiring and rewarding undertakings. But look, let's be honest, in the creative process, in the writing, it can get a little bit messy. So how do you break through writer's block? The first question I would have for somebody that comes to me and says that they have writer's block is, let's get you reconnected with the reason you're writing what you're writing right now. So whether that's a book, whether it's a chapter, whether it's one story within a chapter, within a book, reconnecting with what is the outcome you want the reader to experience with whatever it is that you're sitting down to write. In other words, writer's block, quote unquote, comes up when we think that we have to write for the sake of writing, or writing because we have to create content, not writing necessarily to create an outcome or an impact. And ultimately, when it comes to writing a book and the kind of writing that I care about and that we're going to be talking about here and on this channel, generally relates to a book and a writing that has meaning and significance, both to you personally, but also potentially to anybody that's reading it. In terms of getter's block, I think it's really about reconnecting with the reason that you're writing and putting yourself into the emotional state of what you want the reader to experience as they finish the last word of what you're going to write today. If you can get yourself into that space mentally, then the writing just becomes an imperative, or it just happens by default almost, because you are connected with the outcome that you want to create. So it's about, one way to break through writer's block is indeed using reverse psychology on yourself almost to shift your perspective out of, oh, I've got to write this, or it's hard, or I'm busy, or I'm not in flow, or whatever the actual thoughts are that are going through your mind, and shifting that into, okay, what is the impact that I'm going to create with these words? What is the experience I want the reader to have as they go through? And really, what's the shift that I want to make in that reader's life? Because ultimately, for a book, if it's nonfiction, or even if it's fiction, you want to create an emotional resonance with the reader. Now, fiction and nonfiction are kind of two different beasts. I totally get that. But especially so in the nonfiction space, you want to connect with the reader both on the mental level, so whatever the strategies, stories, experience, whatever is the logical linear part of what you're writing, but you also need to connect on the emotional level. And the emotional level is conveyed best through stories, through personal experiences, through digging up something that has a raw and authentic emotion, an emotional component to it, and filtering that in either to set up the topic or to illustrate a point. But however you do it, having something that connects on an emotional level as well as on a logical, linear level, right away is going to differentiate your writing from other people's, but it also helps to get over that perception of writer's block. So with me so far, just getting warmed up a little on this broadcast, talking about how to bust through writer's block and how to really build momentum in your writing. So if you've reconnected with the outcome you want to create while you're writing, if you've reconnected now with the reason that you're writing even in the first place, then that probably gets you writing. But now how do you build momentum so that it actually does feel easy? It actually does become an enjoyable process. And really the way to do that is, one, through consistency. But through that consistency, meaning, once you get into a flow of once a day and then twice a week and then 3 times a week, I figure if you can do 1 to 2 hours a day, 3 to 4 times a week, you can crank out a book in a couple months. But of course, that's easier said than done. But what happens when you build momentum in this way, meaning consistently showing up and blocking out time to sit down and engage in the writing process, is that your subconscious goes to work even in the time that you're not necessarily writing. In other words, once you have written, and assuming it's not the very first time that you've written on this project, but you've written again and again, and now as you get a little bit further into it, even when you're off doing something else, you can rest assured knowing that your subconscious is sort of playing through different scenarios, playing through the words. Indeed, you've got your antenna up to be looking out for what turn of a phrase, what word, the way that you catch something on a billboard, or maybe as you're at work and something catches your eye. These are the things that start to become little triggers to your subconscious, so that when you sit down at your next scheduled time, it more easily just flows out of you. And the nice tipping point in the book writing process is when you cross that threshold of having to show up because you've exerted the willpower on yourself, or you've created a compelling enough reason to sit down and write despite all the other distractions and all the other mental chatter that could prevent you from doing so. But then once you're consistently in that process, if you cross that threshold where you now feel in flow, then, believe it or not, you actually look forward to sitting down and writing again. Or maybe you create more time because now you're prioritizing it, because you can see and connect the dots and where this is going. And of course, if that's set within the broader strategic set of how this book plays into the unfolding of your career and your life over the coming years, then you've lined everything up forward and backwards to really build momentum in the writing process, and indeed to leverage your subconscious and other things that are sort of working on your behalf while you yourself are engaged in the writing process. And, one quote that I would bring that I think is helpful to build momentum in the writing process is from one of my favorite authors, Ernest Hemingway. And he said, and in fact, I quoted in my own book, Lifestyle Entrepreneur, I would always write until I knew what was going to happen next. And then that way I could be sure of going on the next day. I'll say that again. Ernest Hemingway said about writing and about building momentum in the writing process, he said, I would always write until I knew what was going to happen next, and then I would stop. Because, then I knew, that I could go on the next day. As in, and if you know ultimately how Ernest Hemingway's life ended, he was sadly a conflicted person who ultimately met his demise by his own hand. Somebody who really, I think, wrestled with the creative process and took it more seriously than almost any other writer in the last 100 years. So I take his advice seriously, because not only has he created some incredible books, but I think he really nailed it with that quote, meaning that if you write to whatever point you get to where you're in flow, you're in momentum, you're getting it down, and then you know what you want to say next, as tempting as it can be to just let the hammer drop and get it all out at once, that may not be the best answer. That may be the right time to cut it off such that you already know exactly what you're going to write when you sit down the next time. And so this is an interesting little psychological trick that you can use to your benefit when writing. I say psychological trick is because ultimately, what are we doing? We're playing with ourselves. We're trying to psych ourselves into the writing process by whatever means necessary, and then to stay in it until the project is complete. Again, not an easy task, but to build momentum is pretty easy if you get to the point where you know exactly what you want to say next and it's all very clear, and then you stop and indeed perhaps take a hard break. Like if you're writing at a desk, put everything down, get up, walk outside, or maybe even go straight to a coffee shop or something else that completely redirects the momentum that you did have with writing. So hear me out, because it's potentially counterintuitive to say, well, if you're getting in flow and you know what you want to do next, why would you stop? I think if people see that all the way through, and I've done this more times than I can ever count, right? Just write it all out and then finally get to the end, or go past perhaps my own limits, or writing beyond your limits to the point where you're mentally exhausted, or if it's late at night and you write to the point where you've squeezed the creativity out of the moment, but left yourself depleted or exhausted, that's when I find disillusionment creeps in when it comes to writing the next part and the next part. On the other hand, if you take Ernest Hemingway's advice, if you take my advice, to write up to the point where you're in flow and you know what's happening next, and then program in a hard stop, like you get up and you do something totally different, that keeps the momentum going in some part of your mind and some part of your subconscious, even as your physical activity and your mental focus in the moment shifts to another task. It's almost like putting a bookmark in so that you can pop right back in and reread the last sentence of wherever you were and go straight into the story. That's the approach we want to take on the writing side, of knowing what we want to say next and then sitting down and indeed writing exactly what it was that you knew you wanted to say next. Although the other interesting thing that happens at this point, meaning once you've stopped and you knew what was going to happen next, you took a break, you come back later, and then you write exactly what it was that you wanted to write when you stopped. Something interesting happens there is that in that break is where you can attract in some of the best ideas. So you take that hard stop, you knew what you wanted to say next, but now when you sit down to write again, you might have a little different perspective, a little different twist, or it may be exactly the same to what you were going to write before you stopped previously. You see where I'm going with this? So if you can build that habit and that consistency and that momentum, that's how you actually create your best work, is by sort of being in this writing dance with yourself that carries on for however long it takes, quite frankly. But if you're working from an outline, or the confines of your book or your writing project, you can sort of see where it's all going, but you're not going to get there in just one sitting, in just a week, and in some cases even a month or more. For tools in your kit to both break out of writer's block, which is another way of saying reconnecting with the outcome or the experience you want the reader to have when they read the final words of what you are just about to write. That's a good way to bust through writer's block. But then building momentum is about writing to the point where you know exactly what you want to say next, taking a hard stop, doing something else entirely, and then coming back in, tuning back in, and dropping right back into that flow, because you've got your on-ramp established to the next writing section. So hope this is helpful, and hope everybody that's watching this gets some value out of this discussion on how to bust through writer's block and how to really build momentum in the writing process. I'll be doing more of these lives on YouTube, making YouTube a much more visible, much more interactive part of the Lifestyle Entrepreneurs Press publishing family and as a publishing company. So I'll be sharing my perspective as a publisher. I'll also be bringing in other authors and interesting and fascinating people that I get the pleasure to work with in the course of running Lifestyle Entrepreneurs Press. So if you're interested in getting your book published, I'll put a link below, and you can always go to lifestyleentrepreneurpress.com and learn more about our publishing work there. Once again, I hope this has been helpful. Happy Friday. And that's the end of today's live cast on how to bust through writer's block and build momentum in the writing process. Happy writing, happy weekend. See you soon. Peace.